For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson with a shout out to San Antone, number 46 on our list of top audience cities. And now, in Readout 202 from my free Wednesday Wake Up email newsletter, we bring you a blast from the bench. It seems climate alarmists are very excited that the European Court of Human Rights, whatever that thing is, said that Switzerland violated the right of some old women to live in a climate that never changes and must now protect them from too much heat by enacting policies that won't have any effect, even if they could figure out what precisely it is that the court is telling them to do. It seems a very odd way to govern oneself. Those engaged in an effort to hijack the democratic process through climate lawfare, especially internationally, should heed the warning in the Telegraph that if judges start making policy aggressively, nations might preserve their sovereignty by withdrawing from those international institutions. Or they could just ignore them and dare the court to, what exactly? The ruling is, of course, historic. Euronews Green tells us so. But it's also kind of weird. The Associated Press claims, quote, Europe's highest human rights court ruled Tuesday that countries must better protect their people from the consequences of climate change, siding with a group of older Swiss women against their government in a landmark ruling that could have implications across the continent, end quote. Yeah, unless it doesn't. Because, hang on, seriously, what is Europe's highest human rights court? Is it attached to some government? Are there police and bailiffs to enforce its rulings? Heck no. Europe is overrun with these quasi-governmental bodies with fancy names, high salaries, and large numbers of hangers-on, and this is just one more. It has nothing to do with the European Union. It's part of the Council of Europe, which is not the European Council, it's just some bunch of lecturing nits. Besides, it doesn't matter a Matterhorn yodel what the government of Switzerland does about climate policy anyway. The big problem is China. And anyone who thinks that the European Court of Human Rights is going to send a cop to burn down China's coal plants is even more deluded than the people cheering on this ruling normally seem to be. In the newsletter, we also observe that if you want to push through a public policy that is novel, massive, and potentially painful, it's a good idea to talk people into it, not push them out. Unfortunately, it's a lesson that climate autocrat John Kerry apparently forgot. As the Boston Herald put it, quote, outgoing climate jet-setter John Kerry is again showing his naked contempt for transparency by refusing to reveal his staff in an office that has operated in the dark since its inception, end quote. Canada's Justin Trudeau apparently has the same problem. On hearing that his minority coalition partners no longer back his carbon tax hikes, a newspaper reported that, quote, he doesn't understand why the NDP is pulling back from carbon price support, end quote, in the face of its extreme unpopularity. And then, rather deeper dive, there's Climate Home News grudgingly admitting that, quote, Lusaka's angry taxi drivers, end quote, have a point about subsidies for fossil fuels because, quote, in many cases, they are not just a handout to oil company shareholders, but to ordinary people too, end quote. There aren't as many such subsidies as some people would have you think, but even a successful cosmic reordering of the economy will impose major costs on some people, including those who lose subsidies that on balance aren't a good thing. And if you have such a reordering and it fails, it will certainly hammer the populace. So, surely it's best to level with people, get buy-in, and admit it when things aren't working, rather than just sneering at them. Isn't it? And then there's the problem of shrieking at them. As, for instance, when the allegedly right-wing GB news station hollers, quote, UK weather forecast, urgent danger to life warning enforced before scorching temperatures strike, end quote. Holy cow, what? Deadly heat waves in Britain in April? Must be climate change, right? Well, no. The real story is first that, quote, powerful winds with a danger to life warning will batter parts of the UK today and tomorrow, end quote, which they did, killing nobody. And then, quote, temperatures as high as 20 degrees Celsius will scorch Britain, end quote. Dudes, 20 degrees Celsius won't even scorch an ice cube. Give it a rest. Hey everybody, I've got something new and exciting for you. Thanks to everybody who's been watching the channel and supporting it, we're in a position now to start a new feature, a live webinar, a discussion with an expert on climate change and on the debate on climate change. And our very first one is going to be with Roger Pielke Jr., the honest broker, who's going to talk about the gatekeepers of climate orthodoxy and his own experience with Michael Mann making sure that a paper by Pielke that Mann didn't like didn't get published. The webinar is free, but you have to register. Please click here and sign up. We are excited about this. We think it's just going to be the first in a long series, and we hope to see you there. In the newsletter, we like to give credit where due. We say that if support for nuclear power is a sanity test for climate alarmists, then Canada's Minister for Innovation and Industry unexpectedly just registered as sane. François-Philippe Champagne told the Canadian press that he considers nuclear power part of the renewable energy portfolio. Quote, "Nuclear, definitely. For me, we have to look at hydro, we have to look at nuclear, we have to look at small modular reactors, we have to look at wind, we have to look at solar," end quote. Now, of course, they already have been looking at wind and solar and seeing things that aren't there, so he shouldn't leave therapy yet. But he is making progress. And it is an honesty test for those engaged in policy debate on climate on either side to give credit where due, and he gets some. On the other hand, Pseudoscientific American tells us, quote, "Every spring when the weather turns warm and plants begin to bloom, people start flocking to Nilima Tumala's ear, nose, and throat clinic. They seek remedies for sinus infections, a scratchy throat, and other pollen-induced allergy symptoms. And over the past several years, many have complained that their once run-of-the-mill hay fever symptoms are worsening and lasting many weeks longer than they used to. The likely culprit, Tumala says, is climate change," end quote. Oh, and did someone do an actual study of whether hay fever is getting worse? Heck no, why bother? Everybody knows. And another thing, last December we noted the existence of a post called UN Climate Director and expressed doubt that anyone outside the echo chamber had heard of its well-paid incumbent or should have heard of him. And no, it's not Jim Skay, the chair of the IPCC, who at least said that people should stop saying we're all going to die. Nor is it the president of the various COPs, that's the conferences of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That post is currently held by Mukhtar Babayev of Azerbaijan. The one we're talking about is Executive Secretary of the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change, one Simon Emanuel Kervin Steele. And, give him credit, he's not the sort to yell that we only have 10 years to fix the problem. Heavens no. Instead, Reuters tells us, quote, "UN climate chief says 2 years to save the planet," end quote. And it is characteristic of climate journalism, or what now passes for it, that in reporting these remarks, it did not occur to Reuters to ask even a sympathetic fellow alarmist whether his plan seemed practical, let alone whether his science made sense. Actually, his idea of how to fix the weather would be dismissed as too snide if it were presented as satire. Quote, "Every day, finance ministers, CEOs, investors, and climate bankers and development bankers direct trillions of dollars. It's time to shift those dollars," end quote. No, they don't. The entire world GDP is around $96 trillion, and much of it is not directed on any given day, let alone by that host of bureaucrats and managers. Nor do the people he listed individually actually own much of the world economy, not even the gnomes of Davos. And they can't just say, "Hey, today everyone makes batteries." And another thing, how many countries in the world even have a GDP of over $1 trillion? Not that they could spend it all on climate if they did, even if they had a plan for how to do so. And apparently the answer to that question is 17, largely Western, and already pledged to dramatic climate action for decades to no avail. So, you might think it's time for some cold water, some contrary views, some real investigative journalism. Basically, a reality check. But if so, Reuters doesn't agree. Instead, Steele said, and they parroted, quote, "We still have a chance to make greenhouse gas emissions tumble with a new generation of national climate plans, but we need these stronger plans now," end quote. So, he has a plan for someone else to make a plan. Wow, talk about visionary. And incredibly, it gets worse. Quote, "Steele said he would like to see future COP meetings reduced in size while prioritizing strong negotiation outcomes. He said he was in talks with Azerbaijan and Brazil, host of the next 2 UN climate summits, about this," end quote. Egad, negotiating about prioritizing strong negotiation outcomes. Why didn't anyone think of that in the previous 28 COPs? Good thing he came along, right? And speaking of venerable publications that have lost their balance on climate, what about The Economist, which just wrote a leader, that's what North Americans call an editorial, bellowing, quote, "Global warming is coming for your home," end quote. And instead of their once trademark acerbic skepticism, it's as absurd as you'd expect, starting with, quote, "Think about the places vulnerable to climate change, and you might picture rice paddies in Bangladesh or low-lying islands in the Pacific," end quote. Actually, we might think of the brains of journalists, given how all those low-lying islands have just refused to go under on cue. But anyway, here's the supposed story. Quote, "Another more surprising answer ought to be your own house. About a tenth of the world's residential property by value is under threat from global warming, including many houses that are nowhere near the coast," end quote. Under threat? What does that even mean? Well, there could be weather, you see. Or rather, there is weather, since with climate alarmism, the doom that looms is also here, arrived 2 decades ago, is about to hit in a decade, in a quarter of a century, or 75 years, or did so back then, depending which way the wind needs to be blowing to take off your roof. So, quote, "The full impact of climate change is still some way off," end quote, but it's already here. Quote, "From tornadoes battering Midwestern American suburbs to tennis ball-sized hailstones smashing the roofs of Italian villas, the severe weather brought about by greenhouse gas emissions is shaking the foundations of the world's most important asset class," end quote. Once again, we say bosh. Have you tried buying a home lately? Are they cheap? Actually, the article itself admits that, quote, "house prices show little sign of adjusting to climate risk," end quote. Though, more correctly, they have adjusted to climate risk, which is very small, and you're the ones who've got it wrong. And yet it gets even worse. Quote, "By one estimate, climate change and the fight against it could wipe out 9% of the value of the world's housing by 2050, which amounts to $25 trillion, not much less than America's annual GDP, and it looks destined to trigger an almighty fight over who should pay up," end quote. Destined, huh? We don't see much sign of that. Besides, if we listened to these doomsters and adopted drastic policies that trimmed, say, 1% off global GDP annually, then by 2050 it would have cost us, $25 trillion, the whole amount you were panicking about. This kind of frenzy and mathiness are precisely the sort of nonsense The Economist would once have taken pointed pleasure in puncturing rather than peddling. So what has happened? How has the world gotten so off balance? Here, we'd like to bring up a justly famous TED Talk that was given in February 2008 by popular and academic psychologist Jonathan Haidt. In it, he argued that a crucial difference between liberals and conservatives is that both of them take morality seriously, but, he thought, liberals are primarily concerned about 2 aspects of morality. One is harm/care, and the other is fairness/reciprocity. Conservatives, on the other hand, he said, worry about those 2, but also 3 others: in-group loyalty, authority respect, and purity sanctity. And he made a pretty good argument. But here's the thing. Surely the climate-obsessed liberals also focus on in-group loyalty and appeals to authority, scientists say, and they have a powerful, even compulsive fixation on ritual purity. Carbon is dirty and nuclear is haram, while EVs and solar panels are clean. And as further evidence of our desire to modify Haidt's thesis, we see articles like, quote, "More demand, more gas. Inside the Southeast's dirty power push. Southeastern utilities want to build fossil gas power plants to meet surging demand. Critics say clean energy, batteries, and grid-responsive data centers can do the job," end quote. They can't, but the laws of purity require the zealots to say otherwise. Or just think of the sneering curl of the lip when someone like Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaks of carbon pollution. Touch it and you are defiled. This week in the newsletter in our Getting Worse series, we turn to the issue at the core of the climate problem, our apparently filthy habit of spewing carbon into the atmosphere. The experts say we're adding more and more all the time, and over the coming century, we're going to add so much that it will cause the climate breakdown thingy. Well, how do they know? They have scenarios. They call them shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs, and just like their exploded RCP 8.5 scenario, the SSPs run into the problem that in the intervals where we can check them against what actually happened, they overpredict emissions. And in the years to come, even the lowest SSP scenarios are higher than what the energy experts say is most likely to happen. So, global emissions simply are not on the extreme upward course that the IPCC keeps claiming, meaning neither are climate damages. Oh darn. Then, continuing our fact-check series on Martin Durkin's new movie, which you should watch, we turn to the part where it discusses the interval over the past 20,000 years in which the cold area of glaciation gave way to our present interglacial. Quote, with milder weather, humans began to emerge from their caves, and several thousand years ago, we see the rise of the first great civilizations in a blissful period which, according to many studies, was considerably warmer than today. This is known as Holocene climate optimum, end quote. Remember the endless stories, especially last year, about how it's the hottest it's been in 125,000 years? That date was conspicuously cherry-picked since the last glaciation began 125,000 years ago, and the previous Eemian interglacial was warmer for what were obviously purely natural reasons since there was no industry. But even putting the Eemian aside, even just looking at the period since the last glaciation ended, that business about it being the hottest it's been in 125,000 years is conspicuously wrong if the Holocene climate optimum was warmer than today. And our fact check? It was. Geologist and petrophysicist Andy May has posted a nice summary of the issue, which included a graph combining a proxy record from Greenland with one from the Makassar Strait in tropical Indonesia. And almost all papers reconstructing the Holocene temperature history show the same pattern. As May points out, with the same temperature picture emerging from two places that are so far apart, it can't be dismissed as just a regional phenomenon. And another thing, the Holocene climate optimum was a key component in the development of civilization. As physicist Stephen Koonin said in the movie, quote, it was called an optimum because people thought that warmer was better, end quote. As, I might point out, those who winter in Florida apparently still do for some reason. Finally, in the newsletter, we go into the CO2science.org archive for a study of, quote, a large stalagmite and two tufa deposits in the entrance to Wonderwerk Cave, South Africa, end quote, that use isotope evidence to substantiate that warmer periods, including, yes, the medieval one, saw more rainfall, whereas colder ones tended more toward drought, at least in that area. And, funnily enough, humans there did better when it was warm and wet than when it was cold and dry. Who saw that coming, except everyone who's not a climate alarmist zealot? For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I don't give a hoot what some European pseudo-court says about Swiss climate policy.
That's right.